So, when Pastor Rob asked me to share part of my faith story that relates to giving this weekend, I think when he asked me, it only half clicked in my head what he was really asking. I heard the first part of that sentence, but not really the last part, so I started to say, sure, but I'm not sure at what point when he was saying that it hit me what he was really asking me, and I had that pause in my head and said, did he just say giving? So I had that pause, but I still let out the word sure come out of my mouth. And that's what brings me here today. And I paused only because when you think about giving, I have never really thought about giving and where I give. And usually if I do think about giving, it's that tension there that says, I'm not giving enough. And so I set out on this week looking for some stories in my life. And inevitably, when you start thinking about these things, this whole scale gets in your head of what is your absolute worst giving and what is your absolute best giving. And I think we always kind of function in that kind of an environment. You try to rate yourself against what is the ideal and what is the absolute worst I can do. So my mind went immediately to the worst I could do. And it comes out of Acts. And this is an interesting story because if I didn't know where it came from, I would swear that the result of that story came out of the Old Testament because it sounds very much like something you would hear out of the Old Testament. And this is in Acts chapter 5. I'm just going to read a little bit of it, and then I'll kind of paraphrase the rest of it. But there was a certain man named Ananias who, with his wife, Sapphira, sold some property. He brought part of the money to the apostles, claiming it was the full amount. With his wife's consent, he kept the rest. Then Peter said, Ananias, why have you let Satan fill your heart? You lied to the Holy Spirit, and you kept some of the money for yourself. That property was yours to sell or not sell as you wished. And after selling it, the money was also yours to give away. How could you do a thing like this? You weren't lying to us, but to God. So does anybody know what happened after that? Ananias dropped dead. So, how are we supposed to take that in and figure out what it... But it doesn't stop there. His wife comes back into the scene. And she claims the same thing, that all of the money that was from the property was there for an offering to God. And what happens to her? She dies as well. Sounds kind of Old Testament-y, doesn't it? So let's hold that one up there as this far end of not quite coming to your potential in giving. And I think I struggle with that story because it's not that they didn't give everything, it's that they claimed they gave everything and didn't. So there's a deceit there, and I think that's the important part here. So let's get the other end of that. So I think the one that I naturally come to is it comes from Luke 21, and it's the widow's offering. While Jesus was in the temple, he watched the rich people dropping their gifts in the collection box. Then a poor widow came by and dropped in 2 small coins. I tell you the truth, Jesus said, this poor widow has given more than all the rest of them, for they have given a tiny part of their surplus. But she, poor as she is, has given everything she has. I think that's obviously the other end. She was giving abundantly from what God had given her. And so then I have these gauges in my mind, and I set out on the week trying to come up with stories in my life of when I gave and what it said about me at that phase of my life. And it really does come down to, and these are random stories, so I apologize if they don't quite flow together. But they're stories nonetheless, and if nothing else, it gives you something to reflect on and say, through our life, there are a lot of different avenues that we give, and sometimes we live up to our potential, sometimes we don't. So I'm going to start at the very first memory I have of giving, and I would guess that it's probably similar or the very same memory that a lot of us have, especially from my generation. And that would be sitting in church, and when the offering comes around, what happens? The pocket change comes out, and it gets distributed to the kids, and the kids put it into the basket. And I remember that vividly. It was, I grew up in the Catholic Church, and it was a group of men that would come out, and they were all fancy dressed, and they had, the baskets were a basket about this size, and it was on an extended pole, broomstick, whatever, I don't know. And they would come up each aisle, they would extend it out, and you would drop whatever you had into it. The part that I really remember about this is, and this is the cool part because it kind of, I vividly remember they would all be at the back of the church, so you couldn't see what was going on, but you could hear what was going on. They would be back in the big basket, and they would be turning over these baskets, and you would hear it. So it was this, hearing all this change be put into one and brought forward as the offering. So that's my earliest giving memory, and I'll just call that the innocence of giving. Story number 2, I'm sure a lot of people remember this as well. And I don't know if it was different because I went to a private school or not, but it was always the hunger campaign, and you would go home with these cardboard banks and fill them up with change, and at the end of a period of time, you would bring them back in. And for us, it was bringing them back into school to be offered for hunger. How many people remember doing that? A few people. So I'm going to fast forward a little bit. This would be, I try to think about things between the times when I was really young and the time when I became an adult, and there's not a lot there. I know that we were expected to do service projects, things like that, all the way through school, and but financial giving becomes a challenge because you really have no resources as you're growing up. But graduated from college, and I went to Milwaukee to take, I think it was the time when I went to take an Air Force officer test. I was looking at going into the Air Force as an officer. And I had just finished the test, and I came out of the building, and I had no clue about getting around in Milwaukee. I had to get out and find a city bus and make it back to where I needed to get. And so I believe I had some type of bag with me and all this stuff. And I walk out of the building, and this man walks up next to me, and he's walking with me, and he starts asking me for some money. And, people ask, and you feel that tugging at you. Of course, you're going to reach into your pocket, and you're going to grab something. So I did. I probably didn't have a lot of money on me, but so I give it to him, and we were walking the same direction. He walked on ahead of me, and it wasn't a block later that I looked up and I saw him walking into the next door, and it was a liquor store. Those are the types of things that you think they always make you hesitate giving, but yet when I think about it, we're only asked to give. We can't really say what happens to it after. Once it leaves my hand and it goes to the person I'm giving it to, that's between that person and God, and I'm only asked to give. So that was a learning experience, and I think we're always presented with those opportunities in life where we see somebody that's in need, and you feel like you want to give and you're not sure whether to give. Then, this is not too long after that, but this was early in when Renee and I were married, and obviously you don't have a lot of resources when you're first married. I think for the first few months of our marriage, we lived off of money we got for our wedding. But this would have been perhaps a year or more after that, and you're still trying to get settled in life, and I had a conversation with my mom. And I don't know what got us on that conversation, but it was it was a conversation about giving, and I think I probably said something to the fact of that I struggle with knowing how much to give and struggle with wondering whether I'm giving enough. And she said something to me that I probably had thought of, but it didn't really click. This was early in our marriage, so we didn't have kids. We had a lot of time to give. We didn't have a lot of money. So she said, you guys give a lot of your time to the church. At the time, we spent a lot of time at church with the youth because we were youth leaders, and we did a lot of stuff. So that was a phase in my life and that phase continues. We give a lot of time, but we obviously have resources now too that we didn't have back then to give financially. So I guess we just adjust through the stages of life. And then just briefly through a couple other stories. So through the youth group, we were involved with youth doing collective giving, like we did 30-hour famine, where you collect money for hunger. You're introduced to all these different ways of giving. There was once in our life that we looked at our finances. I should say I looked at our finances because Renee does not like to look at finances. It's my job. And every year you're filling out the card and you're trying to figure out what are we going to do in the next year. And it had been tugging at me for a while to look at whether we could give a tenth of what we had. And now when I say give a tenth of what we had, that's split out through a lot of different sources, the church and through our other giving. But we made a commitment, or I made a commitment that one year that I was going to try it. And I think for the most part we did it. And we got to the end of the year, and I don't think we've done it since. We dabble in trying to get there, and we don't try to do it. So I think we toe that line, and you try to make it, and you don't quite keep that, and you're always trying to adjust as the year goes through. So I'm left with all these stories through my life of different phases and the giving, sometimes feeling like I'm living up to my potential, sometimes I'm not. And I got to the end of the week, I'm like, I got nothing. All I'm going to get up here and do is tell a bunch of stories, and you guys are going to look at me, and that'll be it. But then it hit me. Mahala, this is the part where you listen up. I made her wait for this story. She likes stories on a nightly basis, and I said, this is coming. So I don't really know how old I was. And I don't know why the story didn't come to me right away first thing in the week, but it didn't. My guess is I was probably in the neighborhood of 5th grade. I might have been younger, might have been a little older, but somewhere in that vicinity. And at some point I was at, of all places, the grocery store. And when you think of grocery store, you think of food, right? Instead of food, the set of bowls caught my eye. And they were cereal bowls of some sort. They were glass bowls on the inside. They were white on the outside. It was kind of a gradient pattern that worked its way from orange up to red, had some type of a texture on it. And they caught my eye. I don't know why. I don't know. All I remember is what I did in response to that. So I got it in my head that I was going to get them for my mom and probably my dad. I just... For some reason, they stick out as a mom gift, so it was probably her, but it was probably everything that I could give, so it was to both of them. And I decided I was going to get them, but I did not have the resources. All I could buy is one bowl at a time. So you got to picture this, because here's a boy, of all people, planning ahead, more than 5 minutes ahead. I don't think boys typically do that. And I visited the store probably every week for a series of, I don't know how many bowls I bought. I think the number added up from anywhere from 4 to 8 bowls probably. And by the time Christmas came around, I had a set of bowls to give to my mom. I don't know at what point those bowls disappeared. I don't know what was going through my mom's head as I gave them to her. I think the last bowl disappeared sometime after I went to college. They were breakable, so as happens in every house, stuff breaks. But I don't think any of them remain. And I haven't had a conversation with my mom to see if she even remembers the bowls. But here's what I want to do. Here's what I know from that experience. And I'm ashamed that it didn't hit me until the end of the week on this. It's probably the only time in my life that I truly got it. Right? I got it. I gave abundantly from what I had. I did it faithfully for several weeks. I did it cheerfully. Renee and I had a conversation earlier this week. How do you even hit the point where you give cheerfully? What's that even mean? I gave cheerfully. It was something I really wanted to give my mom. I did it because I loved my mom. I'm pretty sure that that's all that God asked of me. But here's the kicker. And I really want you to hear this because it didn't hit me right away. It didn't hit me until I think I was in bed on Friday night, so it was well after midnight before this happened. Since it was my allowance money that I was saving on a weekly basis, it was my parents' money first. I was only giving them a gift from what they gave me. Does that sound familiar? It's God's money first. We're only giving back to Him what He gave us first. So you know what? I got it in the 5th grade, but I didn't really realize it until Friday night. A little slow to get in. So keep that in mind. Yeah, it's all His first. Thanks.